This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Welcome to the Starlight Ballroom. Hey!
Hello and welcome to Shipwrecked and Comatose, the podcast about Red Dwarf on the Film Stories Podcast Network. My name's Mark Adams and we are here for a special in between, Maid Marian and Series 11, because we did Maid Marian because we can. And it's another one of our interesting spin-offs, in as much as we're going to be talking about Coronation Street. And for those of you that don't know, 10-year stint of Coronation Street, Craig Charles had a go. And, he was there for a good long time, but not as long as he's been on Red Dwarf. I've never watched an episode of Coronation Street, so we needed an expert. So I'm delighted to welcome to the podcast Michael from Conversation Street. Hello, Michael.
Hi, how you doing?
Well, I'm really good, and I've had a weirdly pleasant experience watching Coronation Street for the first time in my life. But thank you so much for coming on.
Well, that's good. That's good. Yeah, when you said this was going to be an interesting episode, let's try and make it that. I think it could be.
So first up, on Shipwrecked and Comatose, we do have an officer's exam for our guests. And, they are 6 questions of, more and more difficult levels as we go along. And the 6th one, be warned, it is tough.
Okay.
So question number 1 was, when did you discover Red Dwarf? And what's your first memory of the show?
It must have been the early 90s at some point. I know when I watched Red Dwarf for the first time, I definitely didn't watch it in order. So I must have picked it up, midway, Series 4, Series 5 maybe. So I was 7, 8 years old maybe. So I didn't really get the context of what was going on. I've definitely got really vivid memories of watching the end of Out of Time with my dad and the cliffhanger that ended on. And then we had to wait quite a few years until Series 7 came out. And then as the 90s went on, I went back and I found some of the VHSs in Smith's. I recorded repeats on the telly, finally got to watch Series 1. So I was like, oh, that's what's going on here. I remember watching the end once and I was like, Rimmer hasn't got his H on his head. What's going on? They must have not had it at the beginning. And then as that decade went on, my love for Red Dwarf grew. I was huge fan. I read the books and joined the fan club. So it was, that was kind of the peak Red Dwarf era for me. And
it's funny that's most people's experience, because it was tough being able to get access to certain episodes, particularly as we discovered when we were reading this magazine. They kept repeatedly postponing the VHS release of Series 1. And I didn't know anything about that background at the start when I was into Red Dwarf as a kid. But I watched it completely out of order to begin with. And then it was almost like a badge of honor to have every single VHS and actually be able to restart and watch it in proper order. Whereas we're kind of spoilt these days with iPlayer and Netflix and all that, aren't we?
Yeah, definitely. It was so difficult trying to get some of the episodes. One of my friends had, I think it was Series 4 on tape, and then we set up 2 VHSs, copy them from one tape onto another just so I could have one. But these days it's just a stick on iPlayer or whatever, and there it is. You got it all at your fingertips.
Yeah. So the second question is, what is your favourite episode of Red Dwarf?
It's a tricky one, and I'm going to sound pretty cliche with it, but I always go between, Dimension Jump, Back to Reality. Even like White Hole I really enjoyed. I think Back to Reality was the one that properly got me into it. I don't remember whether that was one of the earlier ones I watched. It probably was, which made even less sense to me because you get to see their alternate versions more than you see the real ones. But I love the idea of it, and then the twist at the end was so good. And Dwayne Dibley was one of my favourite side characters from the show as I was watching it too.
Yeah, I mean, it tends to be an episode from Series 5 or Series 6 that everyone picks because they are the strongest episodes. I mean, White Hole, like you said, is a fantastic episode. And the thing that sticks out to me about that is that we actually get a bit of meaty Hattie Hayridge, which was actually kind of rare.
It was. I can't remember whether I read the book before I watched the episode. So you get the whole fleshed out version of that story, don't you, in the Back to Reality novel? And then I watched the episode itself, and it was a bit of a mind bend for me. But that is a good one. But maybe Series 4 had some good ones. Dimension Jump, Camille, even I enjoyed.
Camille was great.
And I'd never seen Casablanca. I still haven't, but I still could appreciate it, even though not getting all the references.
Talking about obscure episodes of Shipwrecked and Comatose, we are planning on doing Casablanca.
You are, yeah. So this is the thing with the Coronation Street podcast. There's always going to be new material to talk about, but there's only a finite amount of Red Dwarf.
Well, that's the reality. Is we do love this podcast so much that we want to keep doing it for as long as we can. And then, of course, suddenly Rob Grant and Doug Naylor are friends, and we're like, shit, we're going to have to rush and get somewhere we're ready for the new stuff. We're going to try. We probably won't manage it, but we'll do our best. And so the next question is actually linked to that. What's your favourite season of Red Dwarf?
I think it probably is 5, to be honest. There's a lot of classics on there. Apart from Back to Reality, you got, Hollow Ship. Terraform is pretty good. Demons and Angels. I always like the alternate versions of the crew. So Demon and Angels was a good one for me. I kind of like the slick look of 5 as well. When they went back and did the remastered of the first 3, I was thinking, how far will they go? But Series 4 they didn't. Series 5 they really didn't need to. It just looked nice.
So, as I say, this does get more difficult. Who's your favourite character?
I wasn't prepared for this, You said we'd be doing this exam before we started, but I don't think you told me what the questions are.
No, I didn't. I should have done. Sorry.
It always used to be the cat. When I was younger, he was my favourite, and I think it was because I was young and he was like the cool, funny one, a bit stupid. I enjoyed him, but I always saw people saying, Rimmer's the best, and I think as I got older, I appreciated Rimmer a lot more as well. It's really, really difficult. It's such a strong cast. I'll plump for the cat now, but if you ask me on a different day, I could say it's anybody else. There isn't a bum character.
I mean, the cat's my favourite, and it is for exactly the reasons you're talking about. It's just so almost simple to enjoy the cat. And yeah, I think maybe my love of the cat comes from engaging with the cattiness as a kid. Yeah, you're probably right. Yeah. Jumping around, smoozing around, being cool, just being funny and saying things in a funny voice. That's all it took to entertain me when I was little. Let's be real, I present a Red Dwarf podcast, you present a Corrie podcast. Neither of us are ever going to be as cool as the cat.
This is true. I aspire to be, but I am maybe more of a Dwayne Dibley, it's fair to say.
I haven't got the hair for the haircut, but other than
just stick a mop on your head like they did Back in Their Head, it's fine.
That's true. I'm not going to do that. And so your next question is, what is your favourite moment in the entire show's run?
Oh man, no, this is too hard. I'm not going to go with like the obvious one and do the underpants scene from Polymorph, because I imagine that's what lots of people say. I really, really enjoyed the end of Out of Time. Still going back to it, remember watching that the first time, and the cliffhanger where they all die and then Rimmer's there running through Starbug blasting at the time drive. That one stands out in my head. In White Hole, the "what is it" scene, as a cat fan, I quite enjoyed that. And even the end of Back to Reality, when it all comes out that it was all a simulation, is quite a fun one. So I'm kind of beating around the bush and throwing a few out there, but again, there's so many good moments.
So I know you struggled with that one, but the 6th question is the toughest. Now you're gonna have to a think about this one. Would you like some toast?
No, thank you.
What about a muffin?
No.
Crumpet?
I don't want any crumpets, no tea cakes, no buns, baps, baguettes or bagels. I want no pancakes, no potato cakes, and no hot cross buns, and definitely no smegging flapjacks.
Perfect.
Does that answer your question?
Good. I have to say, you have passed your officer's exam.
Yes.
Welcome to the Shipwrecked and Comatose podcast.
Thank you very much.
let's talk about Lloyd Mullaney. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, because, you will know better than me, but looking at a website called coronationstreet.fandom, Lloyd Mullaney was a character for roughly 10 years in Coronation Street, and the character was specifically written for Craig Charles. He was in 954 episodes, which is a lot more episodes of Red Dwarf. But you've got to remember with something like a soap opera, instead of a cast of 5, there's a cast of, 25, 30 active characters?
Well, not at all now. These days, it's more like 90 to 100.
Really? That many?
Yeah, so you get characters that come in and out of rotation. They're all kind of on the books as regular characters, if you like, but you certainly go through periods where some characters don't show up at all, and then other times where they'll be like one of the main characters for the whole year. I mean, during Lloyd's tenure, which was 2005 to 2015, it would have been less. I don't know, maybe even like 70 possibly. But yeah, there was certainly a lot of times in that 10-year period that we didn't get to see a whole lot of Lloyd. And on the whole, I'd say that he was more a side character in other people's stories rather than being a main character of his own. He did have some Lloyd-centric stories, but when I picture back at his time, I kind of imagine him as being there on the sideline or being a bit of a double act with Steve McDonald particularly.
Well, I think that's fascinating that there's that many. It shows how long it's been since I actually watched a soap opera. The only real soap opera I ever watched was Neighbours as a kid, and there were about 30 to 35 characters. In fact, maybe even less than that, because they all got a slot on the theme tune, didn't they, if I remember rightly? Yeah,
that's right. When Neighbours ended for the first time a couple of years ago, we sat and watched the final week just to say that we've seen it, and it was quite notable for us how few characters there were compared to everyone in Coronation Street. And over the years, more people, the sets expanded, so you got the street itself, which crams more people than really should be able to fit in one house living there. Then they've extended the sets to have like nearby streets where people live. So yeah, there's tons. It's an awful lot of work being in a soap, and having spoken to some of the actors about it, you do need a bit of a break. So it's, in some ways, it's good that they've got those big casts.
Interesting. So I guess that means that a character should potentially have more longevity than an actor going for a couple of years, burning out and going away. So almost makes it more realistic that someone will live in Manchester for 10 years rather than just 2 or 3.
Yeah, and you get a mixture. You do get some characters that come and go in the space of a year, 2, 3 years, but others, I mean, the day we're recording this, Gail Platt, or Gail Rodwell as she is now, has been in the show 50 years. 50 years today is her anniversary, and she is leaving at the end of the year. But
so 954 episodes for Craig Charles. Goodness knows how many episodes.
Yeah, in the thousands for sure. And of course, William Roach, who plays Ken Barlow, has been in it right from episode 1 in 1960. Still going strong.
I actually saw Ken Roach in Salford Sainsbury's a few years ago.
Oh, yeah.
And I was like, who the bloody hell's that? And I was walking my way through. I recognise him. I'm sure he's famous. It took me ages.
That's funny.
And I've got quite a few friends that would have probably been quite jealous.
Oh, I would.
Worked out who he was. I'd have gone and said hello.
Yeah, well, we saw Craig Charles up in Media City last year before, I can't remember, and I was too nervous to go and say hello to him. I've met him once or twice before at some signings that he did, but
cool.
Yeah, we were going through Media City, and one time he was having his breakfast in his hotel, and we thought, he probably doesn't want to be disturbed there. Another time he was out properly in the wild, and I was too nervous.
I think it's cool that actors like the Ken Barlow guy, whose name I've already forgotten, Pat Roach?
William Roach.
Who's Pat Roach? Anyway, and Craig Charles, they're famous, but they just walk around, go to Salford Sainsbury's, get a sandwich, and that's kind of nice. I wonder whether there's that level of culture with popular shows in America. I think it would be more difficult in America, perhaps.
Yeah, kind of imagine them there, flagged by their bodyguards, but who knows?
So, getting back on topic, because I do that. With the research I've done, watching some stuff on YouTube and reading this fandom website, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, the Lloyd Mullaney character had some quite strong storylines that included racism, gun violence, attempted murder, blackmail, hit and run, fist fights, and realising you've fathered a child when that child has grown up. And they're all pretty heavy stuff for pre-Watershed. Was this a controversial character?
No, I wouldn't say so. And it's funny hearing the list of things that you just said. I mean, to me, as somebody who's watched countless characters come and go through Weatherfield, kind of like a standard life, really. Honestly, I don't think that he was controversial in any way. I think he was quite a popular character. He was well loved. But yeah, the stories that you mentioned, that's just what goes on when you're in Weatherfield and you're in Coronation Street.
Fair enough. And so the character, as I think you touched on, was strongly linked to the Steve McDonald character, almost like a Bezzy Mates type thing. And he was a bit of a dog, unlucky in love, brave and hot-headed.
Yeah.
That's the impression I've got as a complete outsider.
No, that's true. I mean, it was funny for me because I'd watched Red Dwarf for years before Craig Charles came into Coronation Street, and when the casting was announced, I couldn't believe my luck to see somebody who I'd grown up watching was now going to be on the show that I watched 3 times a week, or however many times it was on back then. And in some ways, I found it difficult to separate the two. And I think there are definitely some similarities between the character of Lloyd and Lister. I mean, he's a bit of a lad. He likes a beer. He's a lot of fun, but also he's got a heart, and he's not dumb. And I think as Red Dwarf went on, Lister became less dumb. But he did just want a family, and he wanted to settle down with Kachansky. And this is very similar to Lloyd, actually. He went through a few romantic partners during this time on Corrie. And I think getting a family, somebody he could settle down with, is what drove him. Maybe not getting a farm on Fiji, but he wanted to be loved at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I think what surprised me just across the board watching clips of the character was how funny a lot of the stuff was. I mean, there was some nasty stuff, actually. And it was fascinating to see that Coronation Street is funnier than I expected it to be.
Yeah, they especially leaned into that with Lloyd, knowing that Craig was a comic actor. I think he was probably quite easy to write for. I mean, Coronation Street has always been built on a bit of a bedrock of humour, even back from the early days. And I would say nowadays it is more on the dramatic side rather than the humour. But I think when you've got an actor like Craig Charles, that kind of thing can come very easily, and I'm sure that he's a talented enough guy to be able to do a bit of ad-libbing or just, give the expressions that are just fun to watch. With the Steve McDonald partnership, having those two together, because they run a cab firm together, so there were lots of scenes of them just sitting waiting for the calls to come through, and there'd be just the banter between them, and it wouldn't be a million miles away from what you had with Rimmer and Lister in the bunk room, and that was some of my favourite Lloyd bits, just the back and forths, everyday chat between those two. And they've since Lloyd's left, we've got another character that's come in called Tim. I think there's possibly a bit of overlap with them, but now it's Tim and Steve in the cab office, and they've kind of recreated that relationship pretty nicely as well. It's just a nice situation to have two guys in kind of chewing the fat while they wait for the calls to come in for the cabs.
No, that's fascinating, because to me that feels like something that would naturally happen. As much as you miss your old Bezzy mate, you would probably look for that kind of dynamic. It's a risk in a soap opera though, surely, like basically replacing like for like, in as much as people might look at it as repetitive, even though, my best mate moved to the States. I still adore him, but I now have another best mate. Yeah. And that's how life progresses, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. I think with Tim and Steve have got just as many fans as Lloyd and Steve do. It's a little bit similar, it's a little bit different. I mean, these days we don't get as many cab office scenes, to be honest, but they've got a really great bromance going on, just the same as Steve and Lloyd did.
Brilliant. And before we look at some specific scenes that we picked out, we both picked some. I just want to talk about very briefly how Craig's addictions and indeed Red Dwarf caused hiatuses from the show. How was that received amongst fans, both of them?
I'll tell you what, it's going to be the same when we talk about some of the scenes as well. Some of it feels so long ago, it's difficult for me to remember. I mean, he came into the show in 2005, and I know Red Dwarf's been going from the late 80s, but because there's been over 10,000 episodes of Coronation Street now, sometimes things just kind of disappear from my mind. So excuse me in advance if I'm like, I don't remember. I vaguely remember Craig going off because of the struggles he had with addiction. But it might have only been 6 months or so, and characters do sometimes disappear for a while. And because he wasn't what I'd class as a main regular character, it didn't make so much of a difference. I think we were all pleased when he came back. I think it was fairly early on in his time in Coronation Street that he took that first hiatus. But yeah, life in Weatherfield went on. Then you got a couple of other times. I can't remember whether it was 1 or 2 times that he left the show temporarily for Red Dwarf. I think the first time it came back on Dave, he was away for a bit. And then after that, it was a case of 2015. Yeah, I'm going to leave now. I'm fed up of asking, or I'm getting a bit embarrassed of asking for time off. I think I'd better call it a day for now. So in a way, you know, I would have loved him to have stayed in Coronation Street, but you know, we got a bit of extra Red Dwarf on top of that, so it's a bit of swings and roundabouts, really.
Do you want to have a brief look at Back to Earth, seeing as they kind of link to what we've just been talking about?
Yeah, sure. We just happened to we watched it about 5 or 6 months ago. My wife and I, we were doing a marathon of the Red Dwarfs over the course of a couple of months. I think Back to Earth is where we stopped. I was never a huge fan of what they did post that. Even Back to Earth itself is not what Red Dwarf at its peak, I would say. But so it's relatively fresh in my mind.
I would give the Dave seasons a go. I'd not watched them at all until we started doing our podcast, so they were fresh to me when we started looking at them. And they're not as good as Series 5 and 6, but I hated Series 8, and they're much better than that, and they are great fun, and there's some classic Red Dwarf gags in there.
Yeah.
Back to Earth struggled with budget, and it could have done with a bit more brevity, but again, even Back to Earth was better than I remembered.
Parts of it were for me. I found that even they didn't have a laughter track on it, did they? On Back to Earth.
I don't think so, no.
And I think that made a bit of a difference to me, but it was too much of the fourth wall breaking for me. I didn't get on with it.
Yeah, and we said this when we were doing the episodes on Back to Earth, that not only a few years prior to this, that the League of Gentlemen did it much, much better. And there are a few scenes in Coronation Street on Back to Earth,
Yeah.
so if we have a look at those. Well, there was some interesting stuff at the start when they arrived. All the other characters disliked Coronation Street apart from Lister, which was clearly deliberate and quite funny, I thought.
Yeah. I remember, okay, I haven't watched it recently just for this, but the first thing I remember is them driving down into Weatherfield in their little car that they had. Correct. And then they go into the cabin for a bit, don't they? And Rimmer takes charge and says, I can do the accent here. I can talk in this dialect. And then Crichton joins in as well, and the cat, I think. That was kind of, it was just kind of weird to me. And then they had them trying to, what were they doing? Were they trying to find Lister? No, they were trying to find Craig Charles, weren't they?
They were trying to find Craig Charles. So they arrived on the Coronation Street itself, and Steve McDonald, or the actor, looked really, really confused.
Yeah, Simon Gregson.
That's the one.
Yeah, he does a double take, doesn't he?
Yeah, correct. And then they went and saw Tina, and the scene you just described, the ridiculous Mancunian accents. And then there was a scene in The Rover Returns where they did find Craig Charles, and again, I've forgotten his name, the actor who plays Steve McDonald.
Yeah, it's like Simon Gregson, yeah.
Simon Gregson.
Bizarre.
But it made perfect sense that they had Simon Gregson as a character / actor on that. And I think just putting the Tina character in was just a nice little extra, really.
Yeah, I think so. And back when this was filmed, Tina was really hot stuff, and she was one of the most popular characters. She was winning awards left, right, and centre. So wasn't a surprise to me necessarily that she was one of the few that they picked to go in there.
And it's got to be a tough gig, playing a character talking to yourself. And it's really a very funny scene with Craig Charles and Lister. And one thing I wanted to ask you, do you know any of the backstage stuff on Coronation Street? Would an actor seriously be sat in the Rover Returns learning their script?
They would not, no. I mean, but some people still don't even realise that, you know, where you got the street, if you walk through the facade of the Rover's Return there's nothing there. There's maybe a little bit of pub interior, but the actual pub itself is in a studio. You know, 5-minute walk away. So unlikely. I know, sorry. Unlikely that he'd be doing his rehearsing there. I think they'd probably be kicking him out. I think green room or dressing room would be a bit more likely. But it doesn't spoil the fun of the scene.
Not at all. And we, again, touched on this earlier about how he took a break from Coronation Street to go to rehab. And they reference it. I mean, what a good sport. I know. The fact that both Dave and ITV were like, yeah, you can make a joke about your addictions, lol. Brilliant. Like, edgier than you might have expected.
Yeah, maybe. I suppose in part way it shows how well loved Craig's character was on Coronation Street. And I think Corrie were sort of proud to have him. And they thought, well, why not? I think I'm right in saying that when he came on, they gave him a 3-year contract as well, which seems like a little bit more than you might expect for a new character. They really loved having him on the show, so yeah, why not?
Anything else about Back to Earth, or are we moving on to Coronation Street itself?
Let's move on to Coronation Street.
So, I came into this, again, as I said, with zero knowledge, and I just typed in Lloyd Mullaney, Coronation Street, into YouTube. All the videos we're talking about, I will put on our Twitter, and I will also, if I remember, I might not, to put them into the show notes as well. And I think the first scene that I found was, probably an infamous Lloyd and Steve scene. And on YouTube, it was just called Steve McDonald versus Lloyd Mullaney. And it was at a school sports day. And Lloyd chases after Steve because he thinks that Steve has done something to his cab firm or something like that. And the language. Oh, the language. Flaming, toe rag, stupid idiot. And two men in their 40s or 50s having quite a heated argument that leads to a fight. They wouldn't be saying those words.
This is just what I'm used to now watching Coronation Street. Steve McDonald's is particular. Flipping is a curse of choice for him. So there might have been a few of those in there. But yeah, I'm just kind of, that's the way it is. Although even in Red Dwarf, isn't it true that a lot of the words like smeg and goit and gimboid all came to try and reduce the amount of real swearing that Rob and Doug could use?
Absolutely. And you don't get curse words in Red Dwarf, not even in the more recent stuff where you could have probably got away with it a bit more because it's on Dave. But I think you've hit the nail on the head that goit, gimboid, smeg, they're naughty. They are pushing right on the edge of what you can say in a TV show before it becomes swearing. And particularly with how graphic what smeg actually references. I don't think you get smeg on Coronation Street.
I think you're probably right. I think you're right. They're even tamer than that. I mean, we had a crap last week in Coronation Street, and that was...
Oh my...
I know. Probably had to be bleeped for the...
Was that the first ever crap?
No, they've been craps dating right back to the 90s, that's as far as I can remember, but they're few and far between. That and bitch is probably the most explicit that Corrie gets.
Now that's interesting, isn't it? Because bitch and I guess, again, this is growing up in the 90s, the word bastard would be right on the edge of what you might be able to say in front of your mum and your dad. Most people's parents wouldn't let you, but some parents would, the cool parents. And I think maybe that's where Coronation Street pitches it. Would you say it in front of your parents' mom?
Yeah, I think you could be right. I mean, there's been cat fights between the women of Coronation Street going, right back to the very early days in the 60s and 70s. And it's having seen scenes from those episodes now, it does still stand out to me when the characters said it, but not so much so that it's like, well, Yeah, I think it felt kind of natural for characters to say it at the moments they did, in particularly heated arguments. But yeah, it's still quite rare.
And we decided when we were planning this podcast that we would keep it Coronation Street level of language. And our podcast has a reputation for potty mouth, and I'm probably the worst for it. And it's an odd little challenge not being able to say the naughty words that I just say. That's my natural way of speaking.
You're doing a good job so far.
Thanks. I have got a bleeper if I get carried away. And again, this scene was funnier than I expected. It was the first one I watched, and it was really funny. Not just because I kind of laughed at the weird toe rag language, but it was not quite Benny Hill, but it was two daft characters chasing each other, and that was funny.
Yeah, they did lean into the physical comedy quite a bit in that scene, didn't they? And then you got Brian, the head teacher, at the end, sending them off to the headmaster's office like a pair of naughty schoolboys.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Brilliant. And of the 3 fights I've seen of Lloyd Mullaney, he does like a headlock. Loves a headlock.
Oh, I didn't notice that, but I mean, I suppose you, with your wrestling background, you're going to pick up on more of that than me.
Yeah. But again, there is something we're going to talk about in a bit where he gets punched. That came as a shock to me because I'd seen 3 headlocks. I wasn't expecting that level of violence because just by what I'd watched, it all seemed quite tame. So what is the violence level on Coronation Street? Would you see blood, for example?
Yeah, you would. I'm trying to think. I mean, you see people getting punched to the face quite a bit, but then it's, they don't actually get hit. It's the clever camera angles, and then maybe there might be a bit of blood on the floor afterwards. I suppose maybe it's more when there's stabbings or they get the guns out, whatever. That's more likely to be a bloody scene in there, but. I mean, there have been some really, really violent. There was a scene in the late 90s where a character called Jim McDonald, who you might have heard of, played by Charlie Lawson, beats this drug dealer to a pulp, pretty much. And they didn't really hold back in showing the graphic nature of it. I mean, I suppose they must have done somehow for it to have gone before the watershed. But yeah, they'll definitely show a fair bit there. And Corrie has come under fire a little bit in recent years for being a bit too dark and a bit too gritty in some places. That doesn't particularly bother me at all. But yeah. I mean, there's been punch ups right from the go. In
my head, it was always EastEnders that was the darker one, and then Hollyoaks did like a After the Watershed episode where they repeatedly swore, and it became ridiculous. And then there was rape. And it's like, whoa. They went from 0 to 100 pretty quickly with that. Has there ever been a Coronation Street after Watershed?
I mean, occasionally they'll show it after 9 o'clock anyway. There was one episode. Right. There was one episode where there was a siege in a supermarket in 2001, I think, and that was shown. That must have been shown after 9 p.m. And you get these 2 gunmen talking, and one of them says he calls one of them. A word that I won't mention on our very clean podcast here. And I remember going, whoa, they never can't say that on Corrie, but I think that's the one and only time that they have used that word. There was one thing in the late 90s called Corrie After Hours, I think it was, and it was 5 days of episodes that they would show at 9 o'clock. But it was about Steve and some of the others going down to Brighton, and then they'd go on a booze cruise. But there was nothing at all. There's nothing remotely post-watershedy about it, but they were trying to say, well, look, we're going to do something a little bit different. But yeah, Corrie doesn't tend to go too far past post-watershedy.
Fair. So I want to look at the first and final appearances of Lloyd Mullaney. And his first appearance, he's smoking inside, and I was agog. It was that long ago that he was smoking inside, and I think that scene was played to make him a bit of a Jack the Lad, but these days, because he blows smoke in someone's face, that's kind of assault.
Yeah.
And it's a much darker scene than I think it was ever intended to be at the time.
Yeah, I don't think we would have even remarked on it back at the time because people still smoked indoors. People would sometimes blow smoke at each other. I mean, you had a few scenes of Lister doing that on Red Dwarf as well.
Absolutely.
But yeah, Jack the Lad is right. He was that kind of character, which is why, like I was saying earlier, sometimes he and Lister aren't too far apart. It seemed to fit just what they wanted with Lloyd. And maybe that's one of the reasons why the character of Lloyd was created for Craig Charles. It wasn't a case of, we want this character, who should we have? They're like, well, Craig Charles, what do we know him from? Red Dwarf. Let's make a character a bit like him. And he was just a bit more of a grounded Lister, in my head at least.
And I don't know if you know this, but the reason why Lister smokes so much in the first few seasons of Red Dwarf is because Craig Charles was a massive borderline chain smoker.
Oh,
and I wonder whether the character smokes because Craig Charles wanted to smoke indoors.
Yeah, so maybe.
The only other thing of note that I spotted in this was it's the bloke from Boyzone.
Yes.
The bloke from Boyzone was in Coronation Street.
Yeah, if having Dave Lister come onto Coronation Street was weird for me, having Keith Duffy from Boyzone, that was totally bizarre, because my sister was totally into Boyzone when she was little. So I sort of, if I went into her bedroom, there were posters of him and the other four of them on a wall. So it can be hard to switch off thinking this isn't them. And I think actually with his character and with Craig's character, eventually I did, and I saw them as characters in their own right. But partly because, they'd be on your telly 3-4 nights a week for weeks on end. But yeah, that was a funny one.
I do wonder if these recognisable actors is something that brings in a draw, because obviously bringing in Barbara Windsor to EastEnders was a big deal. I remember that when, I can't remember the character's name, Get Out of My Pub, that one.
Yeah, Peggy Mitchell.
Peggy. But it's clear that both EastEnders and Coronation Street, the two big boys, have brought in recognisable actors, whereas other soap operas just don't.
Yeah, I mean, it's not so often that they do it, and I think if they were to do it frequently, you'd start to have to suspend disbelief a little bit much, but sometimes they'll bring in someone as a little cameo, like for example on Corrie's 40th anniversary episode, they had Noddy Holder turn up at the end of the episode, and he gets about 2 minutes on screen, and he's just supposed to be a mate of one of the other characters there. But I think that Craig Charles is a fab actor, and I think he did a brilliant job of getting rid of maybe some people's assumptions they might have had as him as, just the guy off Red Dwarf, or, the Robot Wars presenter, and he put in a good performance. And I think that when Red Dwarf did come back to Dave, and I think I've only seen those episodes once through, maybe twice now, I think he was one of the strongest performers, actually. And I think his time on Red Dwarf helped him hone his craft, as it were. But what you were saying about the final scene that you saw him in, so there was that one, was that him in the cab office with Steve? Do you remember?
So the final scene was his leaving party, or have I got that wrong?
No, right. So is this a big speech that he does?
Yes, I thought that was his final scene.
I can't remember exactly, but they did a live episode back in 2015, which was to celebrate ITV's 60th anniversary, and that was kind of Lloyd's last appearance. But then he comes back again the next episode because Simon Gregson, for one reason or another, didn't want to do the live episode. So when Lloyd goes off with his new girlfriend Andrea, and they have this the car with the top down, and they got balloons going off into the sunset. But then he comes back the next episode, and I think it was because we have to have a final goodbye Steve and Lloyd episode. So he kind of got two exits in 1 week, which was peculiar.
Well, I didn't see that one, unfortunately.
Right.
What I did see was a really, really awkward speech, which is perfectly realistic for someone who isn't a public speaker doing a speech that they don't really want to do. And again, great acting, great writing. You could have had that be really, really slick it just felt domestic, normal, human, and I was really impressed by it. And they even highlight he'd been there for 10 years. Yeah,
and the fact that it was done live as well.
That was live as well?
Pretty sure it was. I think that was in the preceding episode to his final one, and I think that was done live.
Good grief. But yeah, I thought it was a great scene. And the only other thing that I noted was Les Dennis is in Coronation Street.
Yeah, we'll speak about cameo extras. Yeah, he was great. I really, really loved him. And that was another one where when he was cast, and he played a character called Michael Rodwell, who was a failed burglar that tries to rob Gail Platt and ends up marrying her, of course.
Brilliant.
I wasn't sure, and lots of people were not sure what to make of him, because for me, it's just, he's the guy that does Family Fortunes. But he was super. He was really, really good in that role. And he stayed in the show for, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 years. I can't remember. He was brilliant, but it was funny watching back that clip as well a couple of days ago and going, oh, yeah, Michael, loved him.
You sent me over a full episode, which has got 4 scenes of a particularly Lloydie and Stevie situation where Steve discovers over 4 scenes that Craig is enjoying a sexual relationship with his mother.
Yeah. When we first spoke about doing this episode and you said, we'll have to share some famous Lloyd clips, that was the one that my mind immediately went to. If you go to the Coronation Street tour at Media City, before you go in, they show you this 8-minute long compilation of Corrie's highlights over the years, and that scene is in it. I loved it. I absolutely loved that scene. So, like you said, the story is that Lloyd is seeing Liz McDonald, and Steve doesn't know about it. He's keeping it a secret. So when Steve goes to his flat one time, he kind of smells the perfume, and he's gone to collect his keys, and Liz is hiding behind this tiny armchair. The really brilliant writing and great performances, especially the moment the penny drops when Steve was like, "Are you knocking off my mum?" I loved it. Well, how did you find it watching it?
So when I watched the first of the 4 scenes, I thought it was a fantastic opener. And what I loved about it the most was the cliffhanger at the end of the last episode must have been his mum hiding behind a chair.
Oh, probably.
Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. I mean, I'm a massive fan of Doctor Who, and I love a theme tune coming in with the cliffhanger. And the cliffhanger being a mom behind a chair is magnificent. Absolutely magnificent. And I just love the gentle ridiculousness of it. It's normally a teenager hiding away from a mum, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because they've been naughty in the bedroom of their mum and dad's house. And it was really fun. Really silly, but fun storyline. And I bet it happens, a lot of people are into older women or older men.
Yeah, and I think there's about a 6 or 7 year age gap between Lloyd and Liz, so it wasn't completely out of the question. And then Steve is that much younger, but because you've seen them so long being mates, you kind of think, they're about the same age. But yeah, Lloyd was a little bit older.
You find that, don't you? My dad had me late, and his sister had my cousins early, so I'm bang in the centre of the age difference between my cousins and my cousins' kids. And as such, I'm kind of close, but in very different ways with both of them, because I am slap bang in the middle of the two. And 7 years isn't really an age difference when you think about it.
No, but it was enough for Steve.
Oh, yeah.
Nobody wants to think of their mate doing that with their mum anyway, do they? Age difference or not.
No. I really enjoyed the anxiety and the panic as the scenes went along, and clearly Lloyd was going to get caught, and he was getting more and more kind of desperate. But again, much funnier than I expected.
Yeah, those two were great. I mean, sometimes the soap awards will do, as apart from the usual best actor, best actress, best scene, whatever, they'll do a best partnership, and often that's a romantic partnership. But sometimes, and I can't remember whether it happened with Steve and Lloyd, but sometimes they'll have mates as a partnership going up, being nominated for those as well, and those two were gold together.
Yeah. So watching this as it was, as an episode, gave me a real kind of perspective of the experience of watching a soap for the first time since probably about 1998 with Neighbours.
Yeah.
And I'd forgotten the experience of really engaging with a specific storyline and then having to wait 3 minutes while there was another scene and then going back to it and then going to a different scene and then going back to it. And I remember getting frustrated with that as a kid with Neighbours. And I didn't skip the other scenes to try and
really?
kind of like regain that experience.
Yeah.
And it was horrible. I don't want to do it again. I want my storyline and I want to ignore the other stuff I don't know. I couldn't tell you anything about, even though I watched it all, couldn't tell you anything about any of the other scenes in between. Didn't recognise any of the characters. They hadn't been in Boyzone. They hadn't presented Family Fortunes. But the experience of waiting for the scene you want in a soap opera hasn't died all these years since the last time I watched a soap opera.
Yeah, I mean, very, very rarely Coronation Street will do episodes that are dedicated to just one story. We've had a couple in the past month, actually, but it's very, very rarity. But yeah, sometimes you do have to wait and you think, oh, is the next, a scene starts and you think, oh, is there the characters I'm not that into? Or, no, I want to get back to that. But then it's worse when you go weeks without a story. And the way that they film Corrie at the moment is that they'll kind of film things in 2-week blocks, and then the actors will have a bit of a break, and then they'll come back again in a few weeks' time. And so sometimes the story will literally go on hiatus for a couple of weeks. They bring it to a kind of conclusion, but not really. And if you're really, really invested into a story, that can get really frustrating if you have to wait sometimes, the best part of a month to get the next instalment of it.
Yeah, and I'm guessing if you research what's coming up, you might get spoilers as well, which nobody wants, right?
Some people do. We're not. We really try not to do spoilers on our podcast. We don't like knowing, and I think that it does literally spoil it for us. But there's a huge thirst for soap spoilers out there. But even then, they don't always give everything away. Sometimes they're just more of a teaser.
I'm a big Marvel film fan, and I won't watch the trailers. I refuse to watch the trailers or Star Wars trailers. Because I'm like, I want the surprise. There's so many really cool reveals in both of those franchises, regardless of whether you like them or not. The reveal of, I don't know, let's say Thanos at the end of Avengers. If I'd been spoilt on that, it would have been such a lesser experience. So I've never got the thirst for spoilers, but I don't think I'm surprised that soap opera fans want them to.
Yeah, I mean, you see sometimes on YouTube, you'll get channels that will just post the spoilers for next week's and they'll get thousands and thousands of views. People want to know, but I don't get it. I much prefer seeing it when it's on. I suppose the difficulty with doing the Coronation Street podcast, the Conversation Street, is that you're kind of immersed so much in the world of Corrie, sometimes you can't help but find them. And sometimes if we're like planning a future episode, we think, well, maybe we want it to tie into whatever's going on the street at that time, so I'll have a sneaky look. But yeah, I do try as much as I can to stay spoiler free. And what Corrie doesn't do as much these days is put things into the episodes that are huge reveals that aren't on the spoilers at all. Sometimes there'll be things that come right out of the blue, and that's brilliant, and nobody knows about it. But it does feel like a lot of the other reveals, you get a sense that, lots of other people knew that this was going to happen.
I mean, at the time of recording, Deadpool versus Wolverine's just come out, and I am avoiding the internet. I am avoiding friends, I'm avoiding Twitter, I'm avoiding everything, because I haven't got a chance to see it yet, and I'll be really, really cross if anyone spoils the cameos for me. So it's a weird experience, isn't it?
I'm the same. I haven't watched it yet. I want to watch it. I've seen the trailers, but then over the last few days, I've seen a couple of headlines on the news site saying, "Oh, you'll be surprised at the cameos," and I'm like, "No, I don't want to click it. I don't want to know. I'm not sure to see it in the cinema."
Not doing it. But anyway, going back to this episode, it was Corrie, 5th of January 2009, episode 2. I should have said that at the start. And the end kind of like gag was Liz being on both sides, getting cross with Lloyd for referring to her as tail. Great gag. But then being on Lloyd's side because she really likes him when Steve's like, oh, that's my mum. And I loved it. She stole the scene more than Lloyd and Steve, really, at the end. Yeah,
they were great. That's why I said we had to watch that one. That was a real classic Lloyd moment.
And the hands up, and she actually puts her hands up.
Comes from behind the sofa.
Brilliant.
I think I don't know when you wanted to go into this particular story, but I suppose another one that's fairly famous Lloyd-wise was the racism storyline, the casual racism storyline,
that was next up.
Yeah, towards the end of his tenure. So was that, I assume you hadn't heard of any of that before you started doing the research for this?
No, I hadn't. And again, I'll link the YouTube videos we're looking at. The main meaty one is Paul gets castigated for his choice of words. And I think it's really brave that Corrie engaged with that. And it really is as simple as Paul is massively, massively wrong. And it's really interesting the way they tackled the awkwardness of, you know this person, you like this person, but they are so wrong and they're not listening to you.
Yeah, he wouldn't back down.
Yeah. And, you know, as a queer person, I've encountered people who won't listen to me and tell me that it's not homophobic. I'm like, you have literally just said to me that my lived experience is less important than your feelings of the idea of maybe being a bit homophobic and needing to learn. And this really cut deep with me because obviously I'm not black, but the experience of prejudice and people not backing down is just one of the worst experiences that one can have. And not going too far into it, with certain political parties gaining MPs, it can be quite a scary world,
sure,
even in Britain, for minorities. And I thought this was just incredibly well done. Very realistic. And I didn't miss the swearing, actually. This scene really got me. I wasn't laughing at the lack of swearing anymore. I wasn't looking for it. It just worked.
Yeah, Corrie will try and do stories every now and then which tackle these social issues. So this one was a racism one. I don't think we said earlier, but the character of Paul is playing a game of darts and somebody beats him or something and he says, I'll play the white man. And then this is what Lloyd kind of jumps on and saying, hang on a minute, you can't say that. But yeah, Corrie likes to put in, you know, stories about racism or mental health, the raising awareness of particular diseases. So it's not just there for entertainment's sake, but I think they also like to try and raise awareness and get people learning about things as well and questioning their own morals maybe in a way.
And it really resonated with me with you can't say anything anymore. And that was a really deep cut because that is the line of the prejudiced to try and bat you away. And, you know, this again resonates with even being the presenter of this podcast. We call out problematic stuff from the 80s and 90s in Red Dwarf. And a lot of people that have listened to the podcast have given us 1-star reviews because, oh, you're so woke. And it really bothers me that people don't listen to minorities, won't listen to reason, and can't recognise that stuff from the 70s, 80s and 90s wasn't okay.
Yeah, sure. Before I was doing the research for this episode, I look back on that story thinking it didn't work brilliantly. I think sometimes Corrie
Really?
and yeah, I mean, you just saw a little bit of it. I think that sometimes there can be overkill with issue stories on Coronation Street, and sometimes you just kind of want to be entertained, and I think that came at a time where there was a little bit too much of it, possibly at the expense of the general kind of soapy affair stories. I think at the time as well, when I watched it and they used this play the white man phrase, I was thinking, well, I've never heard of that. We talked about earlier, you can't really say the rude stuff or insulting stuff or the most hideous of insults before Watershed, and it felt a little bit tame to me. But actually watching the clips back again just this past weekend, I thought, oh, they actually did a really good job with that, particularly Paul's reluctance to back down. And you're right, that does absolutely mirror the attitude that some people will have when they're called out on saying something that they shouldn't do.
So again, from the outside looking in, the Paul character seems completely unsalvageably vile. Was he a moderately positive character before this storyline?
Yes, he was a relatively minor character. He was a fireman that came in to the show when the Rovers, the pub, caught on fire, and then he ended up dating Eileen, who also worked at Streetcars with Lloyd and Steve. The story that I kind of remember from him was that his wife had early onset Alzheimer's, and when he was dating Eileen, he hadn't told Eileen that his wife exists still. So he's like, the story is that this wife couldn't even recognise who he was part of the time, and he's like, I need a bit of a freedom. But I think so that wasn't a good look for him early on, that he was dating Eileen while still being married to this sort of really ill woman. But on the whole, he wasn't a vile character. And I think maybe one of the things with this story is, you know, it can be anybody that can say something, and it was. He probably, the character didn't even realise at the time that what he was saying was so offensive. And I think sometimes that can work well when you have a character who you think is just a fairly nice guy, or, just kind of bland kind of character, says something that makes you go, whoa. Even they can say that. There was a story just last year where there was a fairly nice, you'd think, young boy who ended up raping another girl, and it was a story about consent and did she give consent or not, and that was quite effective because this was a bit of a golden boy before this happened, but they wanted to get the message that it can be anybody.
And I think what I engaged with the most on this one was actually Steve, and the initial scene we watched, he tried to keep the peace and he tried to kind of like hush the minority. And that's pretty cowardly and it's complicit, and perpetuation like that, it continues the chain of prejudice. It is so tough to call out someone you like. It is so tough to try and explain to someone who won't listen. But we did watch another scene where Steve actually slightly redeems himself. That was called Paul Denies Being a Racist on YouTube. And Lloyd is completely in the right. And Steve does come back and say, look, this isn't okay. Yeah. And it is tough being in that situation. But if you are truly the friend of someone, you need to do the awkward thing. Yeah,
I think in the original scene where it happens, I suppose Steve does the easy thing, in a crowded pub, you don't want things to escalate more, so he just tries to calm it all down. But you're right, when he's then alone with Paul later on, he tells him what he needs to hear.
Yeah, and another scene I watched, again, it's just called Paul Punches Lloyd on YouTube. And this was the punch that I was talking about earlier. It's a really well done punch. It looks right, it looks good, and a spectacular way to start an episode. But my concern about this, does Paul eventually get his comeuppance? Does he acknowledge that he was wrong? Or does the minority just get punched?
I'm struggling to remember how it ended exactly, but I don't think that Paul lasts a whole lot longer than the story. So in a way, the character goes through this and then it ends. But I remember there was a scene where Paul and Lloyd and Steve, and I think it was Brian, the head teacher that we saw earlier in the sports day scene, they were going out for a drink together for one reason or another. It might have been a stag night, maybe, I don't know. And they end up inadvertently drinking in a pub that's full of particularly racist and right-wing characters, and Paul ends up defending Lloyd from them, and I think he kind of realizes, I'm not the same as them, but I can totally see how difficult it must be to be somebody like Lloyd and have this all the time. So he kind of redeems himself.
Interesting. I did watch quite a lot of other scenes featuring Lloyd. There was a peculiar one where he ends up on a fishing boat. Yeah. There was another one which was grim, where he was at this seedy club and got into a fight with this bloke who'd been beating up women, and a really nasty kind of punch to the floor with a squelch, which shocked me. And then there was a scene where he gets hit with a magazine. So it really is a mixed bag with this character.
Yeah, for sure. That one that you talked about a second there, where gets punched by the guy in the club, that was a character called Chris. I think that was the beginning of a story, because the girl that he's there with in the nightclub ends up dating Lloyd for a bit. But then Chris moves onto the street as well, and he says, I've been diagnosed with a brain tumour. And so the girl kind of wants to look after him, like her ex. But then this Chris is a bit nasty, and he makes the symptoms a lot worse, and he makes it look like he's terminal when actually he's not. He's in remission. And poor Lloyd, he ends up losing this girl, Cheryl, who sticks with her lying ex and boss because she thinks that his brain tumour's worse than it is. And there was a scene, I don't know whether you saw this one, where Lloyd punches Chris. It was out on the street and he ends up knocking his head against one of the curb.
Yes, that was dark.
Yeah, Lloyd realised he can see that he's kind of being played by this Chris guy, and Lloyd feels like he's the good man in this. But yeah, Chris winds him up so much that Lloyd punches him to the floor, and I don't think it was long after that Chris and Cheryl go. But that was another great example of how Lloyd wanted a family, because Cheryl had this kid called Russ, and I think Lloyd liked the idea of settling down with them. And then you get another story of his where he meets up with an old flame from 20 years ago, and it turns out that he's fathered the daughter with her that he never knew about, and he likes the idea of settling down with her, but it just never works out until the very end, because when Lloyd does leave the show, he's met this woman called Andrea who comes in as a bit of a love interest for Steve, and Lloyd and Andrea end up getting together, and now they're living happily on Jersey, I think it is. So he finally got that happy ending that he'd been craving all the way, and I suppose that's similar to, Lister wanting to settle down with Kachansky on Fiji.
Well, he got Fuchsia.
Yeah, exactly. He ended up on the Channel Islands with this girl and took it.
I like that.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to finish with a video where Craig Charles himself picked his favourite moments with Lloyd and Steve.
Yeah.
And there's 5 very quick scenes. One of them's the sports day, which we've already looked at. Mm-hmm. There's a scene with a house of cards where they get their heads bashed together, and Craig Charles says that it was off the cuff, and they did get their heads bashed together. And boy, oh boy, can you tell they got their heads bashed together.
You can hear the clonk.
You can only do one take of that, because ow!
That was a great example of just the fun dynamic between Steve and Lloyd in the cab office, and then Eileen, the kind of the long-suffering switch operator, who feels like she's a bit of a mum to them sometimes because they're just like a pair of teenage boys. But that sort of stuff was great. And they also did a little spin-off called Streetcars Stories, which was an online spin-off that lasted 4 or 5 episodes maybe, and that was just kind of little 3-4 minute vignettes of what they would get up to in the cab office. Corrie knew that they were onto a good thing with this partnership, and they'd like to lean into it whenever they could.
Well, I didn't get round to watching that, but I've had great fun doing this, so I am going to... Oh, it's only going to be, 20 minutes?
Oh, yeah, if that.
I've spent more time than that watching Prince Among Men, and trust me, this will be better. So I'm going to give that a watch, which... I would have never thought coming into this. I'd be like, I want to watch more Corrie. This was just a curiosity for me, but I'm definitely going to watch that.
There you go. That's how it gets its hooks into you.
Maybe. But my favourite character's not in it anymore.
That is true, yeah. Could still come back, you never know. I'd love it. I'd love it if he came back.
The next scene is another scene with Eileen and the boys, and it's where she throws cakes at them. And it's really fun that these silly, thoughtless boys get silly comeuppance. And Craig talked about how it was an ad-lib where the cake lasted on Simon Gregson's face so long that he just took it off and ate it. Yeah. And again, brilliant, just brilliant. What this comes across as is very much the Craig Charles that was on the Coronation Street set was the same Craig Charles that was absolutely hilarious on the Smeg-Ups tapes for Red Dwarf.
Yeah.
And just had a laugh, made the job fun, and ad-libs that ended up actually being used.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think when you have a comic in a part like this, sometimes they will allow a bit of ad-libbing and off-the-cuffness because they know it's going to go down well with the audience.
I think if he was playing a different character that didn't have this relationship with Steve McDonald, it would have probably been a bit wrong, but this felt right.
Yeah.
Next up, there is a scene with some Northern Soul where they're dancing whilst ironing. And do you know what? I've always meant to go and see Craig Charles live, I hadn't even clocked that Northern Soul was his thing, and that's my dad's thing. Maybe I can go and see some Craig Charles with my dad. That'd be good.
There you go. That's your way in. Yeah, that particular scene, it's not one that goes down in Corrie history as a totally memorable scene, but it was nice to have Craig Charles be allowed to have a bit of a bop in his living room to the music that he loves so much.
What made me smile about it is I have a flatmate that we're really close, we're great friends, but there's no romantic thing there at all. There never has been. And my partner lives elsewhere. But I'm exactly like that in the flat, completely overly familiar, just walking around ironing with my shirt off, and he does the same. And it just made me smile because that's just a matey dynamic. And it just made me smile. It reminded me of my friendship with Ollie as well.
One thing that people say about Corrie these days, one criticism that's aimed at it, is that they don't do enough mates. And I think that's definitely true. There's like family dynamics or just characters that are colleagues at work, but there aren't so many characters that are just mates with each other these days. And Lloyd with Steve and now Lloyd and Tim are kind of one of the last bastions of mateness on Corrie. And I wish they would do it a lot more, because this is when you get great moments like that.
And the last one was, it's another reference to sleeping with his mum. And it wasn't really memorable to me because we'd already done the previous episode, but it's a nice little video, and I think it's really fun getting the actors backstage talking about their favourite scenes, because like you just said, it may not be the same favourite scenes as the people watching the show. Because, like you said, the Northern Soul one wasn't a memorable one to you.
No, not at all. But I think different things will stick in the actors' heads, won't they? They'll have their stories about when it was filmed, or if there's anything like the Northern Soul that just personally resonates with them. Corrie don't do that too often, having the actors reflecting back on favourite moments. But it's always nice when they do.
Is there anything else you want to talk about before we wrap up?
I think we're kind of done. I think we've covered most of his stories. Did I send you the clip of the one where he's got a box of what he thinks are tortoise ashes, and then he's scattering them and they get blown in his face? Did you see that one?
Yes, I did see that.
That was with the character who came in, who had been his girlfriend 20 years ago, and she had their grown-up daughter, and the story behind that was that he thought that he'd accidentally taken this woman's tortoise to the tip along with the rubbish, so then he had to spin this lie that the tortoise had died overnight, and then he came up with, and then the woman says, "Oh, I've cremated him, I think," and she puts together this box of not ashes at all, I can't remember, it was like burnt newspapers or whatever, and Lloyd has to say this eulogy to the tortoise, knowing full well that he hadn't killed this tortoise, and then the wind catches him and the so-called ashes go in his face. It's kind of a funny moment.
So I actually work in the funeral industry, and it is quite difficult scattering ashes. You need to make sure you know which way the wind is blowing. So this isn't unrealistic. Yeah. And I remember when we scattered my mum's ashes, we made damn sure we weren't going to get a face full of mum. And this is done, it's much more light-hearted than talking about dead mums, because obviously this is a tortoise. But, pet funerals are a thing. And what's really interesting about that is there's a common misconception about what ashes are. Most people think it is the coffin that has been burnt to ashes, like in a fire. That's not true. What ashes are is when someone is cremated, everything burns except the skeleton. And the skeleton is put into a separate machine and powdered. It's called a crenulator. Right. So when you get someone's ashes, or a tortoise's ashes, or a cat's ashes, or whatever, it's actually ground bone. So it is really, really grim if you do botch it with your ashes, because you literally get someone's bones up your nose and in your mouth and in your eyes.
This podcast has taken a turn to the macabre, hasn't it?
I don't think it's macabre.
Yeah, I suppose if you work with it.
Well, every day, and but I didn't know until I started working as a funeral celebrant that was the case. I'd assumed like everybody else did. And so I don't know if it was meant to be dark, because it's really grim if you botch your scattering. But it was very, very funny.
They had a similar scene, I think, picking the back of my brain, in Desperate Housewives as well. I don't know whether you ever watched that. And I'm sure I can remember a scene where Susan's out on a lake and gets ashes over herself or somebody.
But yeah, you need to be careful with ashes scatterings. This is a pretty realistic scene, actually. It happens a lot.
Well, there we go. A little public service announcement to the listeners then.
Michael, it's been brilliant having this conversation. I wanted a gimmicky episode, but I've come out of it with a much bigger appreciation of what Coronation Street achieves, and this character is great fun and much more light-hearted and, you're right, closer to Lister than I expected. So I've had a really lovely time. I don't know about you.
Oh, absolutely. We've been talking about this for months, haven't we? That we need to do this together. I've been looking forward to it. It's been fab. And I think I've said to you earlier that sometimes when a character leaves the show, because there's so much, the pace is so frantic, they can kind of disappear almost from your memory. And it's been lovely going back to this character that I really, really did love. And just remembering some of his best moments. I still kind of, because I love Red Dwarf so much when I was younger, I still kind of pinch myself when I think I got Craig Charles on Coronation Street for 10 years. It's unbelievable that it crossed over these really niche interests of mine. So it's been lovely being able to share that with somebody else.
Yeah, thank you for sharing it with me. Where can people find you and your lovely podcast on the internet if they are a Corrie fan and went, wait a minute, there's a Corrie podcast, I need to listen to that?
Yeah, just in case there's any other crossover there, we're Conversation Street, so we do 2 podcasts a week. Our blog is conversationstreet.podbean.com, but you can get it anywhere where you get your podcasts. We upload big chunks of the episodes to YouTube as well, so if you prefer to do your podcast listening on YouTube, then you can find us there as well. We're all over social media. We're on X.
Brilliant. And if you're looking for me, I'm Mark Adams HC. On social media. I only use Twitter and Instagram, and I'm not particularly good at Instagram. But if you're looking for Red Dwarf podcastery, if you're looking for Shipwrecked and Comatose, we are at Red Dwarf Pod on Twitter. We post all of our links on there. But like Michael says, if you're listening to this on the Coronation Street feed, just search for Shipwrecked and Comatose on whatever you listen to Conversation Street, and you'll probably find us. So thank you for listening to another episode of Shipwrecked and Comatose. And until next time,
Shipwrecked and Comatose, a Red Dwarf podcast, was created and produced by Mark Adams and Kurt North. You can find us on Twitter at Red Dwarf Pod, and we are part of the We Made This Podcast network.